The old Winchester 1897 shotgun lay propped against the makeshift weapons rack in the bombed-out farmhouse, its steel barrel dulled by months of combat, but its action still smooth as silk. Staff Sergeant Audie Murphy ran his thumb along the worn wooden stock, feeling the grain beneath layers of scratches and dents. The weapon seemed almost ancient compared to the M1 Garands his men carried, a relic from another war entirely. Yet something about its weight felt right in his hands as German artillery rumbled in the distance, like approaching thunder. The farmhouse sat on a gentle rise overlooking the Meurthe River Valley in northeastern France, where November fog clung to the earth like wet wool. Murphy's company had been holding this position for 3 days, part of a broader push to clear German forces from the Vosges Mountains. Intelligence reports had suggested light resistance, scattered Wehrmacht units falling back toward the Rhine. Those reports had proven dangerously optimistic. Private Jenkins sat by the shattered window, his young face pale in the grey morning light. The boy couldn't be more than 18, fresh replacements who'd arrived just last week to fill the gaps left by the autumn fighting. He kept glancing at the Winchester with obvious skepticism. "Sarge, you really think that old scattergun's gonna make a difference against a whole company?" Murphy checked the shotgun's chamber, sliding in a fresh shell with practiced efficiency. The weapon held only 5 rounds, and he had maybe 30 shells total. Against modern infantry tactics, it seemed almost absurd. But he'd learned something about close-quarters fighting that the training manuals never taught. Sometimes the difference between holding and breaking came down to psychological impact as much as firepower. Lieutenant Davis emerged from the cellar, where he'd been studying maps by candlelight. The young officer looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes from 3 sleepless nights. He'd called the shotgun a museum piece when Murphy first acquired it, trading 2 packs of cigarettes and a bottle of cognac to a retreating French partisan who swore the gun had killed more fascists than any rifle in Normandy. "Murphy, I just got word from battalion. They're pulling back the flanking units. We're going to be alone out here for at least 6 more hours. The fog began lifting around 7, revealing movement in the tree line across the valley. Murphy counted muzzle flashes, estimated distances, and felt his stomach tighten. At least 40 men, possibly more, advancing in disciplined bounds toward the farmhouse. The radio crackled with static as Corporal Williams tried to raise battalion headquarters, getting nothing but white noise in return. Murphy positioned his men at windows and doorways, creating interlocking fields of fire. The Winchester rode in his hands like an old friend, its weight familiar and reassuring, despite the desperate mathematics of the situation. When the first Germans broke from cover, racing across the open ground in short sprints, he let them close to within 50 yards before giving the order to open fire. The M1 rifles of his squad cracked steadily, their distinctive ping echoing through the morning air as clips ejected. But the enemy kept coming, using smoke grenades and covering fire to mask their advance. Murphy watched through the drifting smoke and knew with cold certainty that rifles alone wouldn't be enough. Not today. The first assault wave reached the farmhouse perimeter just after 8 o'clock, and suddenly the fighting became intimate and brutal. Germans poured through the broken barn, rushing the main house with Schmeisser submachine guns chattering. Murphy moved through the narrow doorways and cramped rooms, the Winchester's devastating, close-range power stopping attackers cold in ways that surprised even him. Each blast thundered through the confined space, the weapon's psychological impact magnified by its primitive, almost medieval violence. German soldiers who had faced artillery barrages and machine gun nests found themselves unnerved by the primal terror of buckshot in close quarters. The sound alone seemed to freeze men in their tracks for that crucial split second that meant the difference between life and death. Jenkins took a bullet in the shoulder during the second wave, but stayed at his post, bleeding steadily into his field jacket. Williams got the radio working long enough to report their situation before shrapnel from a Panzerfaust knocked him unconscious. The young corporal lay crumpled against the stone wall, breathing but still. "How many shells you got left for that thing?" Jenkins called out, pressing a torn undershirt against his shoulder wound. Murphy did a quick count. Maybe 15 rounds remaining. The Germans were regrouping in the barn, their voices carrying across the yard in sharp, urgent commands. He could hear them dragging equipment, setting up for what would certainly be their final push. Simple mathematics suggested this was where everything would end. Lieutenant Davis crawled over from his position by the kitchen window, his uniform torn and muddy. Blood trickled from a cut above his left eye, where flying glass had caught him. "Murphy, I'm not going to order you to do anything stupid, but if we don't break up that concentration in the barn, they're going to roll right over us." The young sergeant looked at the Winchester, then at the faces of his remaining men. 5 effective fighters left, counting himself. Jenkins wounded but still able to shoot. Williams unconscious but breathing. Outside, at least 20 Germans preparing for an assault that would overwhelm them through sheer numbers. Murphy had learned something during his months in the Vosges Mountains that they'd never taught him back in training. Sometimes the textbook answer got everyone killed. Sometimes survival meant doing something so unexpected, so contrary to doctrine, that it changed the entire dynamic of a fight. He stood up, checking the Winchester's action one more time. The old gun's mechanism worked with the smooth precision of quality craftsmanship, each part fitting perfectly with its neighbors. There was something reassuring about that mechanical certainty in a world where nothing else seemed predictable. "Give me 2 grenades," he said quietly. Davis stared at him. "What are you thinking?" Murphy looked toward the barn, calculating distances and angles. What he was thinking violated every principle of modern infantry tactics. But conventional wisdom had already failed them this morning. What happened next would defy every principle Murphy had learned about modern infantry tactics. Instead of waiting for the assault, he grabbed the Winchester and 2 grenades, then walked straight out the front door into the farmyard. His men watched in stunned silence as their sergeant advanced alone toward the barn, the old shotgun held at port arms like some frontier lawman from another century. The Germans, expecting defensive fire from the windows, were caught completely off guard by this single figure walking calmly through what should have been a kill zone. Murphy could hear their confused shouts, the sudden scramble to redirect weapons that had been aimed at the farmhouse windows. Time seemed to stretch as he crossed the 30 yards of open ground, each step deliberate and measured. Jenkins watched from the window, his wounded shoulder forgotten. "He's lost his mind," the private whispered to no one in particular. "That crazy son of a gun has finally lost his mind." But Lieutenant Davis saw something different in Murphy's advance. There was no panic in the young sergeant's movement, no desperate charge toward certain death. This was calculation disguised as madness, a tactical innovation born from absolute necessity. Murphy had recognized what conventional doctrine couldn't address. Sometimes the only way to break an impossible situation was to do something so unexpected that it shifted the psychological balance entirely. The barn erupted in muzzle flashes as German rifles and submachine guns opened fire, but their hasty aim was off. Murphy reached the entrance and disappeared inside. For 30 seconds, the sound of the Winchester echoed from within, 5 distinct booms followed by the sharp crack of exploding grenades, then silence that seemed to stretch forever. When the smoke cleared, Murphy emerged from the barn, methodically reloading the shotgun with mechanical precision. Behind him, the surviving Germans retreated across the valley in full disorder, their assault broken not by superior firepower, but by one man's absolute refusal to accept defeat. Some carried wounded comrades, others simply ran, but all of them moved away from the farmhouse with the desperate urgency of men who had witnessed something beyond their understanding. Williams stirred against the wall, consciousness returning slowly. What happened? Where's Murphy? Jenkins pointed toward the figure walking calmly back across the farmyard. He just walked into that barn alone and broke their whole attack. I saw it, but I still don't believe it. Lieutenant Davis was already composing the after-action report in his head, searching for words that would capture what had occurred without sounding like complete fiction. How do you explain in official military language that one man with an obsolete weapon had accomplished what an entire squad with modern equipment couldn't manage? Murphy reached the farmhouse door and paused, looking back toward the barn. The Winchester hung loose in his hands, its job finished for now. But something in his eyes suggested that what had just happened would live with him far longer than any official citation could capture. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The armor support arrived 2 hours later, finding Murphy and his remaining men still holding the farmhouse. Captain Morrison climbed out of the lead Sherman tank, his crisp uniform a stark contrast to the mud-stained, blood-spattered clothing of the men who had held the line. He surveyed the scene with the clinical eye of an officer accustomed to reading battlefields. "Report, Lieutenant." Davis struggled to find the right words. The official language of military reports seemed inadequate to describe what had actually transpired. Enemy force of approximately 40 infantry attempted to overrun our position at 0800 hours. They were repelled with heavy casualties. Morrison nodded, making notes on a small pad. Casualties on our side. 1 wounded, 1 temporary unconscious from concussion. No KIA. The captain looked up sharply. You held against 40 men and took only light casualties. Murphy stood quietly to one side. The Winchester now returned to the makeshift weapons rack. He'd said nothing since emerging from the barn, his usual economy of words reduced to absolute silence. The weight of what he'd done seemed to settle on him gradually, like dust after an explosion. Jenkins had found some medical supplies and was properly bandaging his shoulder wound. The bleeding had stopped, but his hands shook slightly as he worked. "Captain, you should know what Sergeant Murphy did. He single-handedly broke their assault." Morrison turned his attention to Murphy, studying the young man's face for signs of the heroics being described. What he saw instead was exhaustion and something deeper, the look of someone who had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Is that accurate, Sergeant?" Murphy finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I did what needed doing, sir. Nothing more." But Williams, now fully conscious and sitting up against the wall, wasn't content to let the moment pass with such understatement. "Sir," he walked straight into their position with nothing but that old shotgun. "Alone. I've never seen anything like it." The captain made more notes, already thinking ahead to how this would be written up for battalion headquarters. The men who fought at divisional and regimental level needed success stories, clear victories that could be understood and repeated. What had happened here would become part of that narrative machinery, processed into citations and commendations. Murphy seemed to sense this transformation beginning. The messy reality of fear, desperation, and impossible choices was already being refined into something cleaner, more suitable for official consumption. The Winchester that had felt so natural in his hands now looked like a prop in someone else's story. Lieutenant Davis watched his sergeant's face and recognized the burden settling there. Murphy would carry this day differently than the others would remember it. They would speak of heroism and tactical brilliance. He would remember the weight of that old shotgun, the faces of the men in the barn, and the knowledge that what he'd done couldn't be repeated or expected of anyone else. What the official report would never capture was the moment Murphy hesitated at the barn entrance, the Winchester heavy in his hands as he heard voices inside. Young voices, some no older than Jenkins, speaking in rapid, frightened German. For 3 heartbeats, he stood frozen between the tactical necessity and the human cost of what he was about to do. The secret that would haunt him wasn't the courage of walking into that barn alone. It was the sound of that first shotgun blast in the confined space, the way it echoed off stone walls, and the silence that followed. It was the realization that the war had changed him into someone who could make that choice without hesitation once he'd made it. The grenades had finished what the Winchester started, but by then the decision was already complete. Jenkins would later tell the story as heroics, Williams as tactical genius, Lieutenant Davis as necessary leadership under impossible circumstances. Each version would be true but incomplete. None of them would mention the way Murphy sat alone in the farmhouse after the armor arrived, staring at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. The French partisan who had sold him the Winchester claimed it brought luck to whoever carried it. What he hadn't mentioned was the price of that luck, or who ultimately paid it. Murphy understood now that some weapons chose their wielders as much as they were chosen, and that understanding came with obligations that extended far beyond any single battle. Captain Morrison finished his preliminary report and prepared to move the column forward. The Vosges Mountains campaign had objectives that couldn't wait for individual moments of reflection. Murphy and his men would be relieved by fresh troops and rotated back for rest and resupply. The machine of war would continue its inexorable advance toward the Rhine. "Sergeant Murphy," the captain said quietly, pulling him aside, "what you did today will probably earn you a commendation. Maybe more than that. How do you want it written up?" Murphy looked toward the barn, where smoke still drifted from the broken windows. "Just put down that we held the position, sir. Nothing fancy." But Morrison had already seen too much combat to accept such modesty. "Son, what you did was exceptional by any measure. The division needs to know that men like you are setting the standard." "With respect, sir," Murphy replied. "What I did was what the situation required. Any of these men would have done the same if they'd had to. This wasn't false humility or tactical modesty. Murphy genuinely believed that ordinary men could be pushed to extraordinary actions when circumstances left no other choice. What he couldn't see was that most men, faced with the same impossible mathematics, would have found a different solution, or no solution at all. The Winchester would be returned to the supply depot, tagged as obsolete equipment unfit for modern warfare. But Murphy would carry its weight with him long after the war ended, along with the memory of that moment in the barn doorway when he chose to become something other than what he'd been before. 20 years later, Murphy would wake from dreams of that November morning in the Vosges Mountains, the phantom weight of the Winchester still heavy in his hands. The official citation hung framed in his study, words like exceptional gallantry and decisive leadership printed in neat bureaucratic language. The paper couldn't capture the sound of his boots on the frozen farmyard or the way the barn door had creaked when he pushed it open. Jenkins had visited once, in 1953, driving down from Detroit, where he worked in an auto plant. They'd sat on Murphy's porch, drinking coffee, carefully avoiding direct mention of that day. But when Jenkins left, he'd paused at his car and said quietly, "You know, Sarge, I never thanked you proper for what you did. Not just the barn, but for keeping us all together when things got impossible." Murphy had nodded, understanding that some debts could never be fully paid or forgiven. The weight of other men's lives, carried successfully through crisis, didn't diminish with time. If anything, it grew heavier as the years passed, and you realized how easily things could have ended differently. The Hollywood version of his story would emphasize the dramatic moment, one man against impossible odds, triumph through superior courage and marksmanship. What the cameras couldn't show was the longer war that continued in quiet moments, when the scent of cordite in winter air could transport him instantly back to that farmyard, or when the sound of a shotgun at a neighbor's farm made him pause whatever he was doing and count his breathing until the feeling passed. Lieutenant Davis, now a colonel stationed at the Pentagon, had called the previous week. They'd talked about mutual friends, unit reunions, the way the army had changed since their war. Near the end of the conversation, Davis had mentioned, almost casually, "You know, Murphy, I've read a lot of after-action reports over the years, written quite a few myself, but I've never seen anything that came close to capturing what actually happened that morning." Maybe that's for the best, Murphy had replied. Some things don't translate well to paper. What couldn't be translated was the knowledge that heroism and tragedy often wore the same face, that the moments which defined you were rarely the ones you would have chosen. The Winchester had been a tool, nothing more, but it had also been a choice that couldn't be unmade. The young men in that barn had been the enemy, but they had also been young men who would never see another spring. The war had ended with parades and celebrations, with grateful nations rebuilding and moving toward uncertain peace. But for those who had carried the weight of impossible choices, the armistice was just the beginning of a different kind of service. Murphy understood now that true courage wasn't the absence of doubt or regret. It was the willingness to carry both, along with the memory of what you'd done when everything depended on it. In his desk drawer, wrapped in an old field jacket, he kept 5 spent shotgun shells, not as trophies, but as reminders that behind every medal there was a human being carrying memories the rest of the world would never fully see. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.